Christmas dinner was in full swing when my daughter-in-law leaned over the turkey and said, "You don't belong here, old lady. I'm Alden 58, a semi-retired accountant, and the smell of gingerbread barely covered the sting." Under the tree, the glass ornament my late wife and I bought on our first Christmas together caught the light. What would you have done in my place? The first thing I noticed was the way candlelight trembled on the wine glasses, as if even the flames weren't sure they belonged. Snow tapped the windows like polite knuckles, turkey steamed, cloves and cinnamon drifted over the table. Someone proposed a toast to fresh starts, and we all lifted our glasses. Then Maribel leaned in, smile neat as a seam, and said, "You don't belong here, old lady." My fork paused an inch above the plate. The room clicked silent, one sharp clink of silverware, and then that hush parties get when the joke misses and no one wants to pick it up. I dabbed my mouth with the napkin, counted to 2, and let the heat leave my face. Across the room, the tree glowed, and near its middle, a glass ornament caught the light, the first my wife and I ever bought together, cheap and perfect. I steadied my breath on that small circle of glass, the way a man at sea fixes on a buoy. Jonas cleared his throat. His eyes slid to a harmless spot on the tablecloth. Cousins discovered urgent business with the gravy boat. The radio in the den pushed out a choir of voices, 2 beats too cheerful. I set my fork down and reached for water. Condensation slicked the glass cold against my palm. "I'm only teasing," Maribel added, airy, as if tone could unsay words. "We just want everyone to feel appropriate to the space." "The space has done fine with me in it," I said, keeping my voice even. "I've learned that dignity is a door you hold open for yourself." Dessert arrived. Gingerbread. The old recipe in my wife's handwriting smudged where the molasses had kissed the index card. I tasted the year the oven died and the neighbor let us use theirs. The year Jonas insisted the angels sit crooked because angels fly, they don't stand. Memory is thrifty like that, it keeps what costs the most. While plates were exchanged, I glanced again at the ornament. It glimmered through branches like a small planet with our past in orbit. Numbers are my living, but I measure holidays in weight, the heft of a tree trunk on my shoulder, the mass of a room when a sentence drops into it. Jonas gathered dishes. I rose to help. "Sit, Dad," he murmured without looking up, and the gentleness stung worse than a shove. In the kitchen doorway, steam curled from the sink. The window fogged and cleared with each draft from the back door. Laughter tried to restart and stumbled. I stepped to the living room and straightened a loose strand of lights. Sap tacky on my fingertips, I felt the house breathe around me, old wood, old paint, 1,000 small repairs that add up to a home. Behind me, Maribel's heels clicked. "After the holidays," she said brightly, "to no one and everyone we should make a plan. The house could be so much more us. Open up the rooms, new fixtures, maybe neutral tones. Jonas and I have a mood board." "Timeless is tricky to buy by the gallon," I said. She smiled like I'd proven her point. "We'll talk. It will be easier once the paperwork is simplified." "Paperwork," I repeated as if tasting a spice that didn't belong in the stew. My reflection curved in the ornament, older than I feel, still here. Outside, a car hissed past on slush. Across the street, Lorna stepped out in a robe to throw rock salt, looked up and lifted a mitten. I lifted mine back. It helps to be witnessed even by a neighbor in boots. When the coffee was poured and the nieces disappeared toward a movie conversation, took the shape of next year, trips, diets, resolutions. The table remembered to breathe. But a new draft ran through the room, the kind you don't fix with weather stripping. I took my seat again and let the china rattle settle. There are moments you stand on a threshold and only later realize it. The door was already opening. Maribel set her cup down with a soft, decisive tap. "So," she said, tucking hair behind her ear after New Year's, Let's sit with your dad and map out how we'll redecorate the house to make it more modern." Her eyes slid to the tree. Clean lines, less clutter, a fresh start. The kettle hissed behind me, a steady whisper in the small kitchen. Outside, snow stacked itself against the porch rail in patient layers. The tree still stood in the corner of the living room, its lights unlit for the first time in weeks, the glass ornament catching stray daylight from the window. Maribel sat at the table, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't yet sipped from. Jonas leaned against the counter, arms folded in what looked like casual ease but felt rehearsed. "I've been thinking," Maribel began, voice light. "It might make sense to transfer the deed to Jonas and me. Just to simplify the finances. Taxes, insurance, it could all be cleaner that way." She smiled as though she'd offered to shovel the walk. I poured water over the tea leaves, letting the steam rise into my face. "Cleaner is always good," I said, turning to set the pot down between us. "But I'd want Silas to draft the paperwork. He's been my lawyer for decades, knows the property better than anyone." Jonas's nod was quick, agreeable. Maribel's was slower, accompanied by a glance toward the window. "Of course," she said. "Whatever makes it easier for you." The phone rang, a tinny trill that cut the air. I picked it up and Silas's voice came warm and wry. "Just calling to wish you a happy new year, Alden. And to remind you, never give up that lifetime occupancy clause. Ever." I chuckled, said my thanks and hung up, but his words stayed perched in the air like a bird refusing to fly away. Maribel opened her planner. "If Silas can get us something by next week, we can sign before the new year. Then you can stop worrying about the boring parts of ownership." I slid the deed across to her, already annotated, with the clause in bold, plain language. "We'll keep it simple," I said. "One condition, lifetime occupancy. Just a formality, but important to me." She scanned the page, her thumb smoothing over the line. A small crease formed between her brows, then vanished under a polite smile. "Sure," she said. Jonas signed, first pen scratching in a broad, confident loop. Maribel took the pen, her fingers resting on it a beat longer than necessary. Her signature came slower, neat, each letter pressed into the paper, as if she could leave a deeper mark that way. "There," she said, sliding it back across the table. The kettle, now cooling, gave a final sigh. A draft slipped in when Jonas went to fetch more firewood, and the steam from our mugs shivered. Maribel rose, smoothing her sweater. On her way out of the kitchen, she paused by the living room doorway. Her gaze rested on the tree, on that same glass ornament still hanging at eye level. The lights caught in it again, throwing a soft reflection across her face. She turned away without a word, leaving the smell of steeping tea and the faint trace of her perfume behind. I topped off my cup, the paper with our 3 signatures still warm from her hand, and thought about how clauses, like ornaments, were fragile things. The trick was to hang them where you'd notice if they ever went missing. The bell over the coffee shop door gave a tired jingle as I stepped in out of the wind. The place across from St. Luke's hadn't changed in 20 years, old oak floors that creaked like good manners, mismatched mugs, a chalkboard with saints' names for the specials. Steam rose from the espresso machine and fogged my glasses. When I wiped them with a napkin, the paper left a faint brown ring where someone had set a cup. By the creamers sat a stack of flyers for the church's Elder Care Fund, white paper, blue ink, a photograph of a gloved hand steadying an elbow on icy steps. Silas was already at our usual table by the window, hat on the chair, leather case underfoot. He'd ordered my coffee the way he always did, which is to say, correctly. "You look well," he said, which is what men say when they're about to ask if you're all right. "I've had easier winters," I said, sliding into the seat. The window rattled. Outside, a gust lifted powder off the church steps. He tapped a pen against a coffee-stained napkin, once, twice the rhythm of a man deciding where to start. Alden, he said, lowering his voice, I've seen this before. Families push the deed transfer as a kindness. Then they change the locks with a smile. It's tidy on paper and messy in the soul. I kept the clause I said. You did, he nodded. Which means you're not defenseless. But people don't always shove you out the door, not at first. They make the room smaller around you. They move your chair. They move your picture frames. They talk about what you won't need. They'll wait for you to flare, then call that evidence that you're unwell. Tap, tap. The pen marked a dark dot on the napkin. The barista drifted past, setting down a plate of cinnamon rolls that smelled like every December I ever liked. A couple at the counter discussed the weather as if it were an exam. I opened a small notebook, the one my wife once called my pocket conscience, and wrote, "Document everything." Wait. Witnesses. Natural witnesses, Silas added, reading my hand. Not the kind you stage. A neighbor who happens by. A mailman who notices the wrong door is locked. You don't provoke. You don't perform. You simply live and you let the pattern become visible to other eyes. I can do patient. I said, though, patience feels different when it's winter. The cold makes time sound louder. He smiled. I remember finals week. You color-coded your panic. Worked for me. It did. He leaned back, studying my face. You loved that house with your wife. You love it still. Love doesn't make a legal argument, but it sharpens a man's attention. Use that. We talked through dull necessities where the papers were who could verify the clause which neighbors still kept spare keys from the old days. Every practical step felt like an admission that the unthinkable could in fact be thought. I sipped my coffee. Heat slipped down my throat and steadied the part of me that wanted to fix everything with a speech. What about Jonas? I asked finally. Silas set the pen down. He's a decent kid who's learning how easy it is to let someone else drive. Decent people drift too. Don't set the match to him. Let him see the smoke on his own. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour, soft, then softer, as if it didn't want to interrupt. I closed the notebook and slid it into my coat pocket, heavy as truth. They'll slip up eventually, Silas said, leaning in until I could smell the cinnamon on his breath. You just have to be ready. On the way out, I took one of the flyers and folded it in half, then half again, until it fit in the wallet slot, where I keep numbers that matter. The wind hit me square in the chest as I crossed the street. St. Luke's stones looked older for being cold. Back home, the house had the stillness of a person listening. I hung my coat, shook snow from my hat, and heard voices down the hall. Maribel stood with a handyman in the dining room, a tape measure stretched like a question mark between them. This wall, she was saying, tapping the plaster, we could open it up, make it more efficient. And those built-ins. They're charming, but dated. Picture clean lines. The man scribbled on a clipboard. Jonas held the end of the tape, face careful, as if precision could absolve him. I stayed in the shadow by the doorway and watched the pencil move. The smell of dust lifted from the baseboards, dry and old, and suddenly dear. I cleared my throat, not loudly, just enough to be polite. 3 heads turned. Maribel smiled with all her teeth. We're just exploring possibilities, she said. You'll love it. I looked past them toward the living room. The tree still stood. The ornament still caught light. In my pocket, the notebook pressed against the folded flyer, and between the two, a space opened where resolve could fit. The house was already settling into its night sounds when I caught the first thread of whispering. October had sharpened the air. The roast chicken we'd eaten an hour earlier still hung in the hall like a memory of heat. I paused where the runner meets the bare oak, one sock on rug, one on wood, and listened. The refrigerator hummed steadily from the kitchen, a soft mechanical breath that almost hid the voices. The storage room, Maribel said, clipped, as if the words might cut her tongue if she lingered. He'll get used to it. He hates the cold, Jonas whispered back. It's damp down there. It's temporary, she said. We need him to see the logic. Then we can look at facilities. Something affordable. The word affordable flattened itself into the humming. A coin slipped under a door. I leaned closer to the wall the way you do when you want the plaster to volunteer its secrets. There's one on Broad Street, Maribel continued, voice turning administrative. Basic care, nothing extravagant. We don't need a spa. We need a place that checks boxes. Cheaper doesn't always mean Jonas started then stopped. His consonants softened like he was chewing them before swallowing. He'll feel pushed. He'll be safe, she said, and we'll have space to live like adults. He'll thank us when he adjusts. The refrigerator cycled off. Their words hung for a heartbeat without cover, naked in the dark. I could hear the dry rustle of paper, the slide of a drawer. When the hum resumed, I slipped back toward the living room, letting the shadows gather behind me like a coat I hadn't decided to wear. In the corner, the lamp threw an amber pool over the mantel. The sideboard drawer stood open a finger's width. I touched it, and it yielded, revealing brochures with glossy photos, a woman knitting near a window, two men playing checkers, a tidy bedspread folded with military precision. A yellow sticky note flagged one lowest cost in neat, determined handwriting. I eased the drawer shut until it clicked, the sound small and absolute. I walked into the kitchen as if coming for water. Good dinner, I said, and meant it. The seasoning had been right for once, the skin crisp, the pan drippings dark and honest. Maribel turned hands already busy with a dish towel. Thanks, she said brightly. We were just talking about reorganizing the downstairs. Efficiency. Efficiency is one of my favorite myths, I said, reaching for a glass, letting the faucet run until the water went from cool to cold. Jonas looked at the floor, then at the clock, then at me. If guilt had a posture, it would be his. I drank, said goodnight, and carried the glass back to the living room, finishing it in 3 slow swallows to keep my hands from shaking. The room smelled faintly of thyme and lemon, of old books, of floor wax deep in the grain. I began tidying the coffee table the way lonely men do, stacking coasters, aligning remotes, smoothing a wrinkle in the runner, as if symmetry could keep time from tilting. The tree had been down for months, but the ornament sat on the mantel where I'd set it after the holiday. A small moon with our years trapped under glass. I reached to dust the frame beside it, and my sleeve tugged the branch of cedar we keep there for the smell. The cedar brushed the ornament. It toppled. I lunged, missed by a finger's width, and the ornament hit the hardwood with a dull, decisive tink. Not a shatter, not mercy. I felt the sound more than heard it, the way you feel a tooth crack. I crouched palm to the floor and found it by touch, before my eyes did the smooth, curving skin of glass. Then the flaw, a crescent chip along the rim, where the light snagged and broke. I lifted it into the lamplight. The room swam inside its curved lamp mantle, my own face bent and older. The chip caught the light and threw it back wrong, a bright wound that pretended to be a sparkle. A house can lose its soul by inches. A chair moved a door, relabeled a picture taken down and not put back. I had spent years measuring other people's risks. Suddenly I could feel my own like a draft, slipping under a door that used to seal. My thumb found the chip again, as if it might teach me its shape. I thought of Silas's pen tapping a napkin of the flyer in my wallet, with the gloved hand of Jonas's eyes, doing that quick, frightened math a child does when he knows something is about to break and wants somehow to fix it with silence. I set the ornament in my palm, then in both hands, the way you cradle something living. There are moments a man permits himself to narrate the obvious, if only to keep from shouting it. They are moving the walls closer. They are pricing me, rationalizing me, resizing me. The refrigerator hummed again. Somewhere a branch scratched the siding. I stood slowly, joints speaking their piece, and crossed to the small desk by the window, where I keep envelopes and rubber bands and the keys that don't go anywhere anymore. I opened the drawer. The lamplight slid along the brass pulls, made a narrow gleam on the letter opener. I cleared a space among old stamps and paper clips and laid the ornament in the back corner, away from the everyday clatter, as if distance could protect it from hands that didn't know what it was. The chip flashed once, a tiny signal flare under yellow light, and then the shadow of the drawer took it. I eased the drawer shut until it whispered against the frame. For a moment I stood with my fingers on the wood, feeling the grain under my skin steadying. In the kitchen, a utensil clinked against the sink. "We'll make it nice," Maribel called, as if we were talking about throw pillows. I looked at the faint reflection of my face in the window, the night pressing close on the glass, and listened until the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound left that believed in consistency. "This room's not good enough, then you can sleep in the garage," Maribel said, her voice crisp as frost. She didn't wait for an answer. The hallway light cut a hard line across her shoulder as she turned away. Jonas lingered a beat, hands in his pockets, then followed the floorboards, giving a small, apologetic creak under his weight. Silas had texted that morning, "Patience. Let them cross the line on their own. Patience is easier before the door closes." I took the old cot from the basement, the canvas smelling faintly of campfire and damp. The garage breathed cold. Motor oil and rubber hung in the air. A curl of sawdust nested in the corner like a forgotten season. I unfolded the cot and tried to make the canvas a surface the way you make a sentence make sense by reading it 3 times. My breath fogged in front of me. I could see it rise in thin proof that I was still here. Maribel stood in the doorway for a moment, arms folded, a silhouette cut out of kitchen light. "We'll get your room sorted," she said. "This is temporary." The word temporary hung there like a label on a box no one plans to open again. Jonas said nothing. His gaze snagged on the workbench, then the cot, then me, as if he were inventorying an accident. They went back inside. The house swallowed their footsteps. Wind rattled the metal door and slipped under the gap to test my ankles. I found an old space heater and coaxed it to life. It buzzed like an insect in a jar. On the workbench lay a box of winter gear hats that no longer fit one mitten without a mate. A scarf that still carried my wife's perfume if I believed it hard enough. I wrapped the scarf once around my neck and felt less foolish than I expected. The side door creaked. Lorna Beecham's boots crunched on snow. "Mr. Krause," she called, peering in. "You all right? I saw the light." "Evening, Lorna." I tried to sound like a man who had chosen this. "Just making room for repairs." She took in the cot, the heater, my hands rubbing heat into themselves. Her mouth tightened. "Nonsense," she said softly, and held out a folded quilt, the kind with 7 careful fabrics stitched into a pattern so that meant something to the person who made it. "Use this. It's clean." "I can't." "You can," she said, setting it on the cot and tucking a corner as if making a bed for a grandson. "If you need breakfast, knock." "Thank you." She looked at me the way a decent person looks at a thing that shouldn't be happening in a civilized place and left boots crunching a coda into the night. Later, the mail slot clanged at the front. A minute after Tyler McCord appeared at the garage, a parcel under his arm. "Evening, Mr. Kraus," he said, then paused when his eyes adjusted. You okay out here?" "Temporary," I said, forcing a smile. "Repairs." He nodded, but his eyes widened anyway. "Well, here's that book you ordered." He held it out and hesitated, a small courtesy, giving me the choice to step forward rather than making him cross the room where a cot shouldn't be. I took the parcel. The paper crinkled. His cap had a ridge of frost along the brim. "You call if you need anything, sir." He meant it, and we both knew it shouldn't be his job. When the door closed again, the silence returned to its job of being large. I sat on the cot quilt over my legs, heater nibbling at the cold. The concrete leached the day out of my bones, and then a steadier part of me returned, something like stubbornness, something like prayer. I stared at the ceiling joists. A spider's gray web trembled when the wind found a seam. From inside the house came the soft mechanics of evening, a cabinet door, the hush of water, a drawer closing. Then, unmistakable, the dry click of a lock turning. Not the garage. My bedroom. The sound found me like a name said behind your back, ordinary and final. I lay back and studied the rafters until my eyes stopped wanting to argue with what they'd heard. The heater hummed. The quilt held. I reached for my phone thumb, stiff from the cold, and typed, "It's happening." The screen lit my hands, an unhealthy blue. A minute later, Silas, Tomorrow Diner. Noon. Bring nothing but yourself. I put the phone face down and listened to the wind push at the door. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and thought better of it. The garage settled. I tucked the quilt to my shoulders, breathed into my hands, until my breath made a small, warm pocket, and let the night take attendance, one cot, one heater, one man who still knew the difference between patience and surrender. 2 nights later, the house smelled like forgiveness, roast beef, and rosemary candles, burning 2 sweet napkins folded into agreeable triangles. Maribel met me at the dining room doorway, with a smile trimmed to fit. "Let's start over," she said, gesturing to the chair at the head of the table, as if it had always been mine and always would be. Jonas hovered near the sideboard, polishing a glass with the edge of his sleeve, though it was already clean. From the living room came the low murmur of the television and the creak of the old couch. Silas sat there by coincidence, hat on his knee, leather folder tucked beside him, the way a man rests his hand on a dog that won't bark unless asked. When he saw me, he lifted 2 fingers in a small salute and went back to pretending he was there for the weather. We ate in polite sentences. Maribel praised the butcher. I agreed. Jonas asked about the old neighbor who moved to Florida. I said I'd received a postcard of a beach that looked like a dental ad. The candles threw a trembling gold across the plates. When I reached for the salt, the chair complained under me, a small groan that sounded older than I felt. "About the house," Maribel said at last, setting her fork down on an untouched piece of meat, "I think we can make it more functional. Your room, for example, there's so much wasted space. We can carve out a home office, maybe a nursery, and you can have the cozy room near the pantry for your things. It's more proportional." "Proportional," I repeated as if trying on a suit. I wiped my mouth, swallowed water that tasted faintly of the pipes, and laid a hand on the folder in my lap. "I've been thinking about function myself." Her eyes flicked quick as a bird to the living room and back. "We just want what's best for everyone." "Best," I said, and stood the chair creaking again in protest. I placed the folder on the tablecloth and opened it. Paper slid out with the soft sound of decisions becoming visible. "I want to read you a paragraph you signed," I said, not unkindly. A small sentence with large work to do. Jonas's breath hitched. Maribel stared at the candles as if steadying their flames by will. This deed transfer, I began, index finger. Finding the line by habit retains for me Alden Krauss lifetime occupancy of the property, and provides that if my right to a dignified residence is substantially violated by eviction, by confinement to unfit quarters, by restrictions that effectively bar normal living, title shall revert to me automatically. I let the words sit like fresh paint. It's plain language. We chose that on purpose. A clock in the hall ticked through 3 brave seconds. In the living room, the television murmured something about a storm out west. Silas did not clear his throat, which is to say, he made a sound by not making one. I slept in the garage, I said, for 3 nights in January. My bedroom door was locked. I did not choose the climate control of concrete. I turned a second page. Lorna Beecham saw me there and left a quilt. Tyler McCord delivered a package, asked if I was all right. They are not actors. They are neighbors who own boots and decency. That's not fair, Maribel said, voice bright with strain. We were renovating. It was temporary. You could have stayed with Lorna if you were temporary, I said gently. Is not a defense against cold. I slid a 3rd sheet forward, the notice Silas and I had prepared. This is the activation of the clause. Title reverts. This is the notice to vacate according to law 30 days. I prefer we do this with respect. We've all eaten too many good meals in this room to make it ugly now. Silas's pen tapped once on his closed folder, a metronome to keep the next part from rushing. Jonas's hand curled on the tablecloth, bunching the linen into a small hill. He looked at the paper, then at me, and for a moment I saw him at 7, with cake icing on his chin, telling me he didn't mean to break the lamp. I'm sorry, Dad, he said. Voice-low words landing one by one. Maribel didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the clause as if it might rearrange itself into a friendlier shape. You can't just take it back, she said, lips pressed thin until the color fled them. You signed it over. We will fight this in court. You can, I said. That is your right. But the fight will be with the sentence you signed, not with me. And it will be with the witnesses who were not invited to play their part and did anyway. I folded my hands, felt the ache of the garage in the small bones of my fingers, and smiled without triumph. I don't want a spectacle. I want quiet dignity. 30 days and not a lamp moved without my say. Her jaw worked, chewing air. You're overreacting. We were trying to help. You misunderstand our intentions. Intentions, Silas said mildly from the doorway, having found the exact moment a lawyer can become a human being, are interesting. Conditions are binding. He didn't step farther into the room. He didn't have to. The candle nearest Maribel guttered and came back as if it had changed its mind. Jonas reached for his water and missed the glass by an inch. His hand trembled, then found it. I sat. The chair sighed in relief. For a long moment, the house listened to us think. Maribel lifted her chin. We'll fight this, she said again, and this time the edge of her voice wavered just enough to tell me which part of the sentence she believed. The lawyer arrived right on time, the way bills do. March light slanted through the blinds and laid pale ladders across the living room rug. He introduced himself in a courteous monotone, set his briefcase on the coffee table, and arranged his papers into a diplomatic fan. Jonas stood behind him, shoulders rounded. Maribel kept her coat on as if the visit were a quick errand she could check off and forget. Silas took the wingback chair by the window hat on his knee, eyes on nobody in particular. We'll be brief, the lawyer said, smoothing a page that didn't need smoothing. My clients propose 60 days to vacate provided nothing within the house is altered in the interim. Fixtures, furnishings, status quo. Reasonable, I said. My voice sounded like it had been sanded and oiled. And you'll cease any work planning or removal effective today. He nodded. Of course. The pen he produced was heavy and tasteful, a fountain pen that wrote the word formality even before ink met paper. We reviewed the terms line by line. 30 days would have satisfied the law. 60 would satisfy peace. I initialed margins signed where flags told me to. The air smelled faintly of wood polish from the morning's dusting. Silas leaned forward just enough to witness each signature, a man lending gravity by posture alone. Jonas signed with a hand that didn't quite obey him. Maribel pressed her name into the page as if to leave a dent. When it was done, the lawyer placed the final copy in a crisp envelope and slid it toward me with a small bow, the choreography of civility. Thank you, I said. Tea. No one wanted tea. They left quickly, the door catching a rectangle of sun and then closing softly on the sound of their shoes. Silence expanded into the space they emptied friendly again. On my desk, waiting as if it had made the appointment itself, lay a small collection, a bottle of clear glue, a square of fine sandpaper, and the chipped ornament cupped in a saucer. I pulled the chair in, rolled my shirt sleeves, and took a breath the way a man does at the start of careful work. A nick in glass is not just a flaw. It's a map of where stress decided to live. I cleaned the edge with a cotton swab, the alcohol flashing cool and gone. A dab of glue along the crescent, not too much, let the seam meet itself without pressure. My hands remembered other small repairs, a hinge adjusted, a wobbly chair leg, true to child's toy rescued with string. I pressed, held, counted. From the street came the slow thrum of a delivery truck, then quiet, then the dry rasp of the sandpaper, as I feathered a burr no one else would ever see. Silas watched from the chair, saying nothing, in the precise way that means I see what you're doing, and I approve. Will it hold? He asked finally. Most things do, I said, if you don't pretend they were never broken. The glue went clear. I lifted the ornament and turned it in the light. The seam didn't vanish. It transformed less a wound than a line where two truths met: what happened and what we choose next. We kept the tree in the corner through Lent. Bethlehem habits die slower than New Year's resolutions. The needles had dulled to a green that photographs as memory rather than fact. Still, the branches were kind, and the lights threaded through them remembered their job. I rose, crossed the room, and found the old place for the ornament left of center eye level, where evening lamplight finds it without effort. The hook caught. I let it go. The March sun, low and honey-colored, slid through the blinds and struck the glass exactly along the mended arc. For a breath, it gleamed as if whole again. No, not as if, because it had been tended. Silas stood beside me. Neat work, he said. You always did have a patient hand. Patience is cheaper than replacing everything, I said. We both smiled at the place where the seam glowed, a small private agreement that the right kind of repair is its own testimony. Back at the desk, I opened the file drawer and set the signed agreement on top of older papers that now felt lighter. Below them sat the red leather folder I hadn't touched in a year. I drew it out and opened to the page I knew too well, a balanced ledger of intentions from a time when grief made me generous past wisdom. The page with beneficiaries lay there, calm as a pond. Where Maribel's name had once rested, the paper was blank, an absence that felt like clean air after a long winter. I uncapped my pen and paused a moment of silence for what we almost became. Through the window a cloud passed. Light softened. Somewhere down the block a kid shouted, a dog answered, life rehearsed itself for spring. I wrote steadily, not with anger, not with triumph, just with the clarity that sometimes arrives on a weekday afternoon, when the sun fits the room and the house remembers it is yours. When I finished, I blotted the ink and closed the folder. Silas exhaled a sound like a benediction. The ornament tugged at my eye. The seam had cooled to a faint thread only I would notice. I sat for a while and let the room take inventory. One signed agreement, one repaired. Keepsake, one will rewritten without ceremony. The scent of polish lingered in the air, and in it a quiet satisfaction, not victory exactly, but order. Outside, the ladders of light on the rug shifted a rung lower, and the day, as if relieved of suspense, moved on. Christmas Eve in Bethlehem has its own kind of quiet one that hangs in the air between the church's bell strikes. I heard the first chime as I turned the corner onto Walnut Street, my boots making slow, sure prints in the powder. Snow drifted in easy spirals, catching the glow from the lampposts like it wanted to stay in town for the night. Through the church windows came the low harmony of the choir, a sound that felt older than any grudge. Inside, the smell of mulled cider wrapped around me before my coat was even off. Pastor Reuben stood near the front, his tall frame framed by the wreaths hung along the altar rail. In his hands was a small silver plaque, the edges catching the light from the tree set up by the pulpit. I could read the engraving from 3 steps away, Alden Fund. He held it out as I approached, his smile as steady as the bell's second chime. This, he said, will hang in the fellowship hall right above the coffee urn where everyone lingers long enough to read it. Your donation ensures that no elder in this town will be without a place to turn when home gets unkind. His voice softened. It's more than a gift, it's a safeguard. Silas stood off to the side, hands clasped behind his back, eyes flicking over the gathered faces. Lorna was there, in a cranberry scarf, Tyler in his postal parka, and old Alaric Boone leaning on his cane with a nod that said, "I remember." I shook Reuben's hand, feeling the warmth of the plaque in my palm, before passing it back to him. It was heavier than it looked, the way certain choices are. The service began with the choir's carols and the murmured prayers of people who've known each other too long to need introductions. I sat near the aisle, the candlelight pooling on my lap, like something I didn't have to guard anymore. Midway through "O Come All Ye Faithful," I caught sight of Jonas at the doorway. He lingered there, hair damp with melted snow, scanning the pews until his gaze found mine. He didn't smile, but he didn't turn away either. After the benediction, the cider flowed into paper cups, and the talk grew warmer than the weather. I felt a tap on my elbow and turned to find Jonas shifting from foot to foot. "Dad," he said, voice lower than the bustle around us, "I heard about the fund. If you ever need an extra pair of hands for soup night." He trailed off, looking somewhere over my shoulder. "I'll put you on the list," I said. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an open door. We walked out together into the snow, the town's Christmas lights blinking across Main Street in colors that belonged to no single decade. On the sidewalk under the yellow cone of a street lamp, Jonas hesitated. His breath puffed white between us. Then without any grand announcement, he stepped forward and hugged me, brief, almost awkward, but real. "Merry Christmas," he said, and started down the block before I could answer. His footprints filled with snow before I reached the corner. Back home, the house felt different, as if it had listened to the evening and approved. The tree still stood in the corner, patient as ever, waiting. I switched on the lights, and the mended ornament caught the glow in its seam, turning it into a line of quiet fire. I stood there a moment, letting the room be exactly as it was, warm, still mine. Then came a knock at the door, 3 soft raps spaced like someone testing a memory. The mended ornament still hangs where the morning light can find it. the seam catching gold like it was born that way. I've learned that keeping your ground doesn't always mean raising your voice. Sometimes it's holding steady until the truth walks in on its own. Justice can be quiet and healing even quieter, but both last longer when shared. Sometimes bridges collapse so we can learn which ones are worth rebuilding. If you've ever had to stand your ground and still leave the door open, I'd love to hear how you found that balance. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise?